All right. Turn this fan off. How's everyone doing? You're doing okay? Have questions about anything in the course? Oh, happy birthday! Nice. I'm close to my birthday too. It'll be in October. Okay. Did anyone have any questions about how everything is going? The work you're doing on Canvas? Uh, Seems like most people are doing a lot of the work. But you might want to, well, especially people who show up to this, I think, are inherently more likely to be keeping up with the Canvas stuff as well. 'Cause some people are not. Some people are not checking in on often enough, I think. Most people are doing well, but were there any questions about that? Did you see the practice assignment that I gave you? Hopefully that's not too confusing. Okay, so you did it, so that's good. Okay, then, well, I mean, if you haven't noticed so far, a lot of the assignments, my grading is pretty easy because I view all the assignments as practice, as a way for you to learn. And then it's going to be the midterm and the final that are going to be, more graded, more about, how right you're getting it. Whereas for discussions, I usually tend to just give people full credit for it, just for participating. Now, those practice ones, um, I haven't decided yet whether I want to grade you for each of them. I do know that I want to go through all of them with you, so that you understand what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong, that sort of thing. But we can do that right here in class. The midterm and final, they're going to be multiple choice style, so true, false, multiple choice, matching, maybe a fill in the blank here and there, maybe a very short answer, probably not, but no essays. Yeah. It'll be a lot like the quiz that you've already done. It'll just be online. You can take it when you want to. You'll have a whole week to do it. How are the voice levels? Is this working okay? It's hard for me to tell because I've got my volume pedal over here, um, set, I think, lower than usual. Sounds good. Okay. Okay. Well, then, if no one has questions, let's just jump back into it. Okay. So what you've been learning how to do is how to reconstruct an argument, right? To review, an argument is just, well, the definition that I want you to know, of course, that was in the quiz, that I specifically said you should know, is it's a conclusion supported by one or more premises, right? So it's not just the conclusion, right? The conclusion's not an argument. I should clarify that because I realize the wording is a little bit ambiguous sometimes. It means the conclusion along with the premises. That's a whole argument, right? A conclusion with premises that, of course, their job is to support the conclusion. And you get that whenever you have anyone making some sort of claim, whether it's a claim about the nature of the world, right? Whether someone's telling you how something works, or what the truth about something is, or what course of action we should take, what we should do within within a given dilemma. Right? Whenever someone has some sort of opinion that they are sharing, that they are they're making a point, and then they're backing it up with reasons. There we have an argument, right? The problem is that in everyday contexts, both just in conversation and when you're reading something, there's a lot of extra information. Right? So critical thinking requires you to be able to zero in on the most crucial elements. Right? And so to do that, you have to, first of all, of course, be able to get rid of all the extra stuff, right? Trim the fat, as it were. Your first step is going to be what I said, identify the conclusion, right? What is the main point being made? And then you can read through and figure out which main claims are being given in support of that claim, right? Which claims, which premises are being provided to support that claim. And then the point is that you can learn how to, just in your head, right? Right now you're actually doing it on paper. I'm making you actually write out arguments in premise conclusion format. I don't think you'll do that in real life, most likely. But by practicing that in this class, what I'm hoping, and what generally the hope is for these kind of classes, is that you learn this abstract ability, this ability to look at what someone has said, and to sort of organize it in your mind in terms of premises and a conclusion, and sort of pushing other stuff to the side so that you can be really focused on evaluating whether the person has presented a good case or not. All right, so there are several things you do for that, and so these 4 things are all part of that, right? Reconstructing someone's argument. And the final step, number 4, is what you've been doing, learning how to write an argument in that specific format where you label premise 1, or perhaps P1 is okay as well, right? Premise 2 if there's 2 premises, premise 3 if there's 3 premises, line, conclusion. Okay? And each premise is one statement, one true or false statement, and the conclusion is a true or false statement. Okay? And so a few little tips to remember, right? So you should avoid pronouns if possible. Not because there's anything wrong with pronouns per se, right? It is rather that pronouns replace something concrete and specific with a generic word. We want to know the concrete specific thing that we're talking about in each premise, right? So you can't refer back to a previous premise by saying that or it or he. No. What is the specific thing or person that you're talking about? Yeah. And then we did missing and implied premises, and that's where we left off, right? We looked at how to just, you have to kind of look at an argument and see, okay, well, they've given me this premise and they've given me a conclusion, but there needs to be more provided for me to really be able to believe that premise logically entails that conclusion, right? That if that premise is true, the conclusion is true. Well, sometimes you need another step. Sometimes you need another premise, and people don't always fill those out. So that's where we left off last time. So let me just skip through all this. Oh yeah, we looked at conclusion indicators, right, and premise indicators to help you figure out where the argument is by identifying the premises and the conclusion. But as we saw, that's sometimes problematic. You always have to really think holistically with your whole brain and really try to understand what it is that you're reading or listening to. Don't just listen for those premise indicators or conclusion indicators and then assume that you know what the conclusion is or something like that. You really have to think about it with your whole mind. Okay. We did all this. Sorry, I'm extra thirsty today. Very unprofessional of me. Okay. For some reason, when I told you I upgraded my Prezi account so I can use this as a remote. Unfortunately, I can't just click on the section that I want. I have to skip through everything. Which is why this is taking so long. Okay. So we did these exercises. Right. So now we're going to look at sub-arguments. Now, I'm not going to make you deal with sub-arguments a lot, okay? So if this seems overwhelming to you, it's not going to be a huge thing that I'm going to test you on, but it's something to be aware of because it happens in real life. When you're reading someone's argument or listening to someone present their case, a lot of times the premises that they provide in support of the conclusion themselves need some support, right? And when they provide that support, they're providing a sub-argument, right? Sub meaning below, as it were, or nestled in there, right? An extra argument within the argument. So, for example, if you look at this, it might not be immediately obvious that there's a sub-argument, right? So you might be tempted to just think that they're all in support of the main conclusion. But what in fact is going on, if you read it carefully, you'll realize, well, first of all, of course, the conclusion is a computer can't cheat in a game, right? That's the conclusion. So if we use the tip, right, find the conclusion first. A computer can't cheat in a game. And then ask yourself the question, what are the premises that directly support that? It's a rhetorical question and a real question, so that you... I'll wait and see if someone answers. Which of the premises provide direct support for the conclusion? It's tricky, okay, so if you don't get it, it's fine. Don't worry about it. It is tricky, but I just want to see if anyone can think of it. Premise 2, you need that, right? A computer can't deliberately break rules. And number 2. And number 3 is what I was going to say. I thought somebody typed 3, but... Right? So basically, ignore 1 for a second. And just imagine that the argument says, a computer can't deliberately break rules, but cheating requires deliberately breaking rules. So, what's the conclusion, right? That's pretty easy, right? So just to completely ignore 1. Okay, a computer can't break rules, but to cheat, you have to break rules. So you can conclude that a computer can't cheat. That's fine, right? That's an argument already. But now, what if someone says, well, 2, wait, how do you know a computer can't deliberately break rules? I'm not so sure about that. Then someone might say, well, look, a computer has no freedom of action, right? And they might even elaborate on that and explain and say it's just a bunch of zeros and ones. They're following all these basic syntactic rules. There's no freedom of will, freedom of action at all. But cheating requires some sort of deliberate, right, intentional breaking of rules. So it's just not possible for computers to break rules for that reason. And therefore, they can't cheat. They both follow... No, well, only the conclusion follows from premise 2 and premise 3, right? If you're not worried about the truth of the premises. If you're just asking the question, let's suppose premise 2 and 3 were true. Right? Just imagine, let's say that it really is true that computers can't break rules, and that to cheat, you must be able to break rules intentionally. If those are both true, then it does follow that a computer can't cheat in a game, right? That conclusion logically follows. So that's simply ignoring premise number 1 for the moment, and simply looking at premise 2 and 3, and realizing that they support the conclusion. They do, right? It's a whole other question, are they actually true? Remember, there's always the 2 components of evaluating an argument, right? There's the component of, do the premises support the conclusion? In other words, if the premises are true, does that mean the conclusion is true or most likely true? That's the question of support. Then there's the question of, are the premises actually true? Right? So, for this argument, premises 2 and 3 do support the conclusion. Right? They provide support for the conclusion, because if they were true, the conclusion must be true. The only thing is what about the premises? Are the premises actually true? Right? Given the support part is fine. Are premises 2 and 3 actually true? And this is something you could argue about, right? So if you're having an argument about whether computers can cheat, right? Someone might say, you know what, I don't think that's right, and maybe a computer could cheat, right? And you're saying that a computer can't deliberately break rules. I don't know if that's true. What's your support for that? Now here, someone can provide a sub-argument, right? And that's what premise 1 does for premise 2. Now, premise 2 suddenly becomes a sub-conclusion within the overall argument, right? Because 1 is supporting 2, 1 is providing support for 2. Okay. Yeah, the because means that there are premises being provided, right? But one of those premises is a sub-premise. Right? A computer can't deliberately break rules because it has no freedom of action. Now, a computer can't deliberately break rules, that's not the conclusion, right? That's one of the premises. But then it says because it has no freedom of action. That means we've been given another argument, a sub-argument. So, well, here, maybe this will, I have a diagram, okay, so maybe this will help a little bit. Okay. Premise 2 and 3, do you see how I've written this out? Premise 2 and 3 support the conclusion, right? That's what that arrow means. It means if you take premise 2 and 3 together, they logically entail the conclusion. I hope everyone can see that. Now, that's talking about support, right? We have not yet addressed whether premise 2 and 3 are actually true. All that matters is, well, suppose they were true, then the conclusion would also have to be true, logically speaking, right? So that's premise 2 and 3. They're providing support for the conclusion. That's your main argument. So you could sort of even ignore that first premise for a second and just focus on that main argument, right? So is that clear? The way in which premise 2 and premise 3 support the conclusion directly. Because if you take them together, they logically entail the conclusion. Logically entail means if those premises are true, that conclusion must be true, right? It simply follows logically. Of course it does, right? If it's really true that a computer can't deliberately break rules, and if it's really true that cheating requires deliberately breaking the rules, then that means that computers can't do something that is required for breaking the rules. So then that would mean that the computers can't cheat. Right? That's all just in terms of, do those premises support the conclusion? Now what I was saying is, suppose you're giving that argument and you're just providing 2 and 3, sub-arguments are necessary. Well, not always, right? Because you could, this actually turns into a philosophical problem, because you could say that you always need evidence to support your claim. Well, then you'd never be done, would you? You'd always have to keep providing more and more sub-arguments. So sub-arguments are only necessary when there's a particular premise that maybe is in doubt, or that you expect maybe not everyone already knows is true. Right, so typically in the best case scenario, you would want to provide premises that everyone already knows are true, that everyone's going to agree with. That would be great. But in many cases, people provide premises that not everyone's aware of, not everyone's convinced of. In those cases, you'll just need to provide another argument for your premise. To never be done? Yeah, exactly. But in practice, of course, as an individual, you as an individual, that's not going to be practical, right? Now, of course, if you study philosophy, you will want to keep doing that. And if you go into science, then you're part of the large community that sort of keeps asking questions. And there's nothing wrong with that. You want to keep doing that. But in any particular context, you don't need to keep providing sub-arguments. For example, if one of your premises is that, well, what's something that everybody knows? Right? Water is H2O, right? If that's one of your premises, you probably don't need to provide a sub-argument, right? So for practical purposes, for you as an individual critical thinker, sub-arguments are only going to be necessary if one of the premises is controversial in some way or not obviously true. Or perhaps you have a specific audience, right, who's not convinced necessarily of all the premises. So this is going to be contextual, right? So are sub-arguments necessary? They're only necessary when you need to provide extra support for a premise, because the premise isn't something that everybody already knows. I hope that's clear, right? So in this case, that's sort of, you're having kind of a abstract philosophical argument about computers and whether or not they can cheat in a game, right? So I think it's pretty it's a good idea here to provide support for premise number 2. Right? Is it true that a computer can't deliberately break rules? Well, you'd have to flesh that out a little bit. And here I just provided one premise in support. A computer has no freedom of action. But, if you were having a discussion, you could spell that out a little bit in the way that I said, is that computers are completely algorithmic and there's no free will involved or anything like that. And if that's a necessary condition for breaking rules, or at least for intentionally breaking rules, then it does seem like computers won't be able to do that. And so you can visualize it like this. Okay? So we've got the main argument, premise 2, premise 3 provide support for the conclusion. But then that premise 2 is a conclusion in the sub-argument, right? So just go back and forth from the yellow circle to the green circle. When you're focusing on the yellow circle, premise 2 is a premise that supports the main conclusion. When you're looking at the green circle, you're looking at the sub-argument, and there, what we were calling a premise earlier is now a conclusion or a sub-conclusion. I will call it a sub-conclusion because it's not the main conclusion, but it's a sub-conclusion within that argument. Okay? So it's you could think of it as in a slightly different way. In this way, suppose I say something and you say, well, why, right? You're like a toddler who keeps asking why, right? I say something, you say, why? And then I say, well, because of this. Okay. Now I've given you an argument, right? I've said, well, this is true because of this. But then you can ask why again about that thing. Well, why that? And then I can provide support for that again. And now I've given you another argument, but I gave you an argument for one of the things that I was earlier using in support of the first thing. And you can keep asking why. You can keep asking for more and more support. Now, in everyday context, that's not going to happen unless you're dealing with a toddler or a philosopher. Philosophers and toddlers are alike in that way. Or yes, in some way, science as a tradition itself as well. Yeah. But in most everyday contexts, you're hopefully going to rely on premises that are acceptable to everyone. But realistically speaking, that's not going to happen, right? Especially if you think about political discussions that you might have. You're not just disagreeing on the main conclusion, right? You're not just disagreeing on the main fact or whatever that is, or the main viewpoints that you're disagreeing on. There's also all sorts of other stuff that you're disagreeing on, right? I mean, think about right now Democrats versus Republicans and the way in which either side will talk about the protests, right, in support of their point of view. The premises that each side is going to provide are not necessarily going to be acceptable to both sides right away. So then you would need to provide some sort of sub-arguments, right? Yeah. Trying to give an example, but it wasn't very specific, so I don't know if that was helpful. But let's look at another example. There's another example this is an example from philosophy. Oh, this is a very traditional argument for the existence of God. This is one of those things we talk about in Intro to Philosophy, if you took that course. Now, again, these are all just examples, right? I actually don't think this argument works because there are too many premises that are doubtful, even with the sub-arguments. But let's just spell it out here. So I'm not going to ask you right away just to do this yourself. The conclusion here, does anyone want to take a guess at what the conclusion is? Yeah, right. God must exist. So notice that there were two conclusion indicators, right? It says, so there must be a cause of the universe, and so God must exist. Now, you can't have two conclusions at the bottom, right? So this is already giving you a clue that something else is going on. That whatever comes after that second so that must be part of a, or sorry, whatever comes after so, where it says, so there must be a cause of the universe. Since that's not the main conclusion, that's going to have to be a sub-conclusion. Right? So if we write out all the premises, this is what you would get. This is called the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God. It was developed by Islamic scholars, and it's been popularized in Christian apologetics by William Lane Craig, who uses this argument when he goes and debates people. So it goes like this. Yeah, exactly. You've heard it. You've heard some version of it before anyway, right? We've all heard this idea of, well, here's the universe. How could it just pop out into being out of nowhere? There must be a God, right? That's one version of the argument. This is a little bit more sophisticated, but it's the same basic idea. Yeah. So it goes, if the universe began to exist, there must have been a cause of the universe. Big Bang cosmology proves that the universe began to exist. Premise 3, the universe began to exist. Premise 4, the universe had a cause. Premise 5, only God could be the cause of the universe. So just first of all, compare the paragraph on the left to just putting into standard, into premise conclusion format. First of all, hopefully you'll notice that it's already become a little bit easier to evaluate this very complicated abstract philosophical argument, right? Because now you've broken it down into all its individual claims, and those would all have to check out for you to be able to say, this is a good argument, right? If you're going to evaluate this argument, if you're going to say that this is a good argument, that means you have to go through each of those claims to make sure that they're actually correct in your opinion. So this is the structure here. Premise 4 is one of the conclusions. Yes, exactly. Premise 4 is a sub-conclusion. Notice here we've got two sub-arguments. Right, so let's look at the main argument. The main argument is just 4 and 5 to the conclusion. Right? So ignore 1 through 3 for a second, and you'll notice there's already a complete argument there. Very simple, isn't it? The universe had a cause. That cause could only be God. Therefore, God exists. Very straightforward. Those premises do support the conclusion. The support part of it is good. The only question is, are the premises actually true? Because remember, a good argument needs to provide good support, right? The premises have to actually show that if they were true, that the conclusion must be true. But the premises also actually have to be true, or at least acceptable to you. Right? So that's the question. So 4 and 5, they support the conclusion. If they were true, the conclusion would have to logically follow, right? If it's really true that the universe had a cause and only God can be that cause, if those things were really true, then of course the conclusion would necessarily follow. Right? We wouldn't have gotten into what God is or how to define God, or what it takes to be a cause of something. We'd still have all sorts of questions left over. But it's the support part of it is correct. But of course, you're going to have questions about whether or not those premises are really true. Right? For example, 5 is not addressed at all in this argument, right? That only God could be the creator of the cause of the universe. Right? That's a pretty bold claim, right? That's not supported anywhere in this argument the way I presented it here. Right, so you'd have to have some sub-arguments for that as well. Well, why could it only be God? Right? Yeah, there's a lot of variables, of course, yeah. What in this argument, however, they didn't focus on premise 5. The focus is, well, what if someone disagrees with the idea that the universe must have had a cause? Right? So there's many different ways in which you can do that, right? So, for example, the ancient Greeks thought the universe had always existed. So then you wouldn't really need a cause, right? It's just always been there. It didn't come into being out of nowhere. Right? That's the whole thing where people say it must have been God then. If first there was nothing and then suddenly there's a universe, what, it just poofed into existence? People will say dismissively, it must have been God. Yeah, of course, of course. And you should if you haven't yet, take an intro to philosophy class, and we could talk about some different possibilities here. So yeah, one of the possibilities is the universe has always existed, so it doesn't need a cause. So I reject premise four. Or you could say perhaps the universe can be its own cause, or right, or perhaps the universe doesn't have a cause at all. It just doesn't need to be. It can simply exist as a brute fact, right? Remember, keep asking why. Do you at some point you're done, right? Or do you just keep going, right? Maybe there's just a wall that you hit and you just hit a brute fact, right? It might simply be the universe is here without a cause. So there's all sorts of reasons to doubt premise four. So that's why the person who presents this argument will provide support for that premise. Because even though that premise, along with premise 5, provides support for the conclusion, the premise itself has to be true as well. It has to be acceptable to your audience. And so the whole thing is you try to then argue that this premise is true. In the same way that you argue your main conclusion is true, you can also argue that one of the premises you used has to be true, right? So the main argument is 4 and 5 to support the conclusion. But then this person also provided some premises in support of that the sub-conclusion, P4, right? What is the argument there? Well, it goes, if the universe began to exist, there must be a cause of the universe. The universe began to exist. Therefore, what follows? Premise number 4, right? The universe had a cause. This is going too fast. Are you following along? We've got the main argument. The universe had a cause. Only God could be the cause of that universe. Therefore, God exists. That's a whole argument already, right? You're good. But are those premises all acceptable? Are they uncontroversial premises that everyone would accept? No. So you provide a sub-argument. Okay, that's okay. What we're saying here is, yeah. Well, do you see the way in which premise 1 and premise 3 support premise 4? They don't provide direct support for the conclusion. Right? Premise 1 and 3, if you look at them together, they logically entail premise 4, right? Which we can call the sub-conclusion and the sub-argument. So again, now we're not looking at the yellow circle anymore, where we have the main argument with those two premises. Now we're looking at the green circle, where one of the premises in the yellow circle is now a conclusion. So that is a little bit confusing, right? So P4 there is pulling double duty, right? P4 is the main premise and the main argument, but it's also a conclusion in the sub-argument, in the green circle. You know, P1 and P3 provide support for P4, because P4, the universe had a cause, it's not uncontroversial. That's something that people might disagree about or might not know, or it's just not something that's going to be acceptable to everyone. So then argue for it, right? Provide another argument. So if you have a premise that's a little bit iffy, you should provide an argument for it, right? So you're not just expecting your audience to just accept what you're saying on faith, right? So unless it's something that everybody already knows, then it's fine. If you're talking about water being H2O or 2 + 2 = 4, that's fine. But something like the universe had a cause, you're saying something very specific about something that happened, eons ago, that you weren't there, right? You better provide support for that, right? So this person does. They provide support. What they say is, well, look, if the universe began to exist, there must have been a cause. And here, if someone was presenting this argument in real life, they would say something like, for example, right, I've got this soda can here. This began to exist. It didn't always exist. At one point, this did not exist. Now it does. There must have been a cause for it. Something must have caused this to come into being. Right? So the idea is that's the same thing for the universe. If it began to exist, meaning there was at some point it didn't exist and then it started existing, there must be some sort of causal explanation for that. There must be a cause of it, is what the argument is saying. Right? So it's saying if it began to exist, there must have been a cause. Well, guess what? The universe did begin to exist. Therefore, the universe had a cause, right? So still ignore P2 at this point. Don't look at P2. We're just looking at the green circle where there's a sub-argument for one of the premises in the main argument. Yeah, so I'm not going to go to P2 yet. Just dwell on this for a second. Look at the yellow circle. That's your main argument. You've got two premises that directly support the conclusion, right? The universe had a cause, only God can be the cause, therefore God exists. But someone might say, the universe began to exist? The universe had a cause? I don't know, does the universe really have a cause? Then this person says, yeah, because listen, look, if the universe began to exist, it must have had a cause. The universe did begin to exist, so it must have had a cause. Yeah. Of course, part of you is tempted to evaluate the argument, which I'm not asking you to do yet, but you can just for fun. Right? What you really need to do is be able to see the structure of it. Yeah, well, in this case, Anna, there are two premises that are supporting the conclusion, right? You could have one premise to support the conclusion. You could have 3, you could have 30, right? So in this case, we have two premises that directly support the conclusion. So the number is not going to be a clue, okay? But the rest of the premises, if the rest of the premises don't directly support the conclusion, then check, do the premises directly support one of the other premises that does support the conclusion? Right? Then we have a sub-argument. So yes, you provide a sub-argument when needed, when one of the premises is questionable. For example, premise 4, the universe had a cause. That's not obvious. That's questionable. That's open to argument. So it's a good idea to then provide another argument in support of that premise. And when you do that, of course, when you're just looking at that chunk of it, you're dealing with a whole new argument in its own right. It's part of a larger argument, so we call it a sub-argument, but you could simply zero in on the green circle and forget about the yellow circle for a second. Forget about P2. Just look at P1 and P3. Do they support the conclusion? And in this case, again, they do. The logic here all checks out, right? The support works really well in this argument. The logic is pretty impeccable, okay? So premise 1 and 3, if those are true, then P4 is true, right? If it is really true that there must be a cause of the universe, if the universe began to exist, if it's really true that the universe began to exist, then of course, yeah, then it would follow that the universe has a cause. Good so far? Yeah. So when you evaluate the sub-argument, you do the same thing you normally do, right? Do they provide support for the conclusion? In this case, of course, the conclusion is P4. I know that's maybe the confusing part, right? That P4 is a conclusion in the sub-argument and a premise in the main argument. But then we can ask the same thing. Are those premises actually true? Well, in this case, support was provided for the claim that the universe began to exist. What support? Well, Big Bang cosmology, right? What scientists have come to call Big Bang, which, by the way, many people are confused about Big Bang. I guess I don't need to go into this, but the Big Bang Theory does not say that nothing exploded into the universe or something like that. It's nothing like that. Big Bang is based on observations currently that we notice that the universe is expanding, and it's expanding at a certain rate. Right? So that means if it's expanding today, getting bigger tomorrow, that means that yesterday it was smaller. And the day before that it was a little bit smaller. And the day before that it was a little bit smaller. And if you do this mathematically, right, if you use all the nice scientific mathematical formulas, you can come up with a model of what the universe looked like so many billion years ago. Right? And if you rewind time long enough, you get to a point where the universe is this infinitesimally small, dense, hot thing, and if you try to reverse time anymore, our scientific equations just break down. They don't work anymore. That's sort of where we're at today in modern science. It has not really been solved, and Big Bang Theory is not what's called a cosmogenesis account. It does not try to explain where the universe came from. It simply says, given where we are today, we can postulate that at some point it must have looked like this. Right? It must have looked really small, and then we know that it expanded over time. That's all Big Bang cosmology really says. And what it also means is that the universe has a finite age, right? 13.5 billion or something like that. A finite age. The Greeks were wrong, according to this. The universe has not always existed. So that's what this argument tries to do. It tries to say that, well, Big Bang cosmology shows that the universe started existing. Right? Yeah, there's the Big Bounce theory as well, right? You maybe remember that from last semester, or last time when you were in the class. Exactly. Yeah, so there's all sorts of problems with this, right? Which I don't really need to get into in this class. But yeah, the Big Bang, it's not the only model, right, that the universe had to have been finite or a specific age. It may have been contracting and expanding for all eternity. Maybe the Greeks were right? Maybe it was infinitesimally small, but maybe before that it had been bigger and then it contracted. So I don't think this argument works. Like I said, there's too many problems with the individual premises. The structure is impeccable, though, like I said, right? Except, well, maybe not from 2 to 3, but premise 1 and premise 3 do logically entail premise 4. Premise 4 and premise 5 do logically entail the conclusion. The problem is, are the premises actually true, or are they known to be true uncontroversially? And here the answer is no. It is a valid argument if you disregard P2. That one's a little bit weird. Overall, it's a valid argument, but premise 3 is being supported kind of like, it's pretty good, I guess. The Big Bang cosmology proves that the universe began to exist, so the universe began to exist. That's all right, but regardless, it's either going to be, the main argument is valid, and then that second sub-argument is certainly valid, and 2 does provide support for 3. Yeah, and that's why I'm sort of like, I keep just talking about it, and I keep just saying it, so you kind of start getting it, right? Because now, notice, we can do the same thing here, right? You see, now we're providing a sub-argument. We're providing an argument for one of the premises in the sub-arguments. Because just as you might question whether P4 is true, is it really true that the universe had a cause? And the person says, well, yes, I can prove it. It had to have a cause because if the universe began to exist, there must be a cause, and the universe did begin to exist. So there must be a cause, right? So now I can use there must be a cause as one of my premises, right, for the main conclusion. But then someone might still say, well, you said the universe began to exist in premise 1. In premise 3. You said the universe began to exist. What? Because of all the sub arguments, or because I'm explaining it so badly? Right. Yeah. And like I said, we're not going to deal with this a whole lot, but it's definitely something to be aware of, right? Because you got to keep track of what's supporting what, or you can't evaluate the arguments well, right? The blue anglerfish. Okay, well, anyway, the basic idea here is, in any argument, right, you've got premises that support a conclusion. With any argument, you can go on forever. This is what I said, right? Any argument you have where you give some premises, someone could say, well, how do you know that's true? And you say, well, I know that's true because of X, Y, Z. And then the person says, how do you know X, Y, Z is true? Right, so you could do that all the time, for sure, yes. But in this case, that's not really what's happening, right? In this case, it makes sense that they provided sub-arguments because some of the conclusions are not obviously true. So then you want to provide support for your support, is basically what it is. Maybe that's a good way to put it, okay? Right? You're making your main claim. Here's what I think is true. And then you're providing support for that. You're saying, here's why I think it's true. But then you end up giving support for your support as well. You're saying, well, here's why I think my support is true, right? And you do that when you have premises that are controversial, when you have premises that aren't just widely known to be true, right? Then it's your responsibility to explain why those premises that you're relying on are actually true and correct. And so hopefully you can get back to a point that's either just common sense or science or something like that, right? So that's why when you get to P2, right, your ultimate, your final sub-premise where we don't keep going anymore, now we're just appealing to science, right? And that might be something you can do. You can appeal to science as a final authority. The problem here is that they're using science, but they're drawing a philosophical conclusion. So it's still problematic. But that's the idea, is you want to end up providing, ultimately just showing someone that, hey, if you think this thing is true, and this is true, and this is true, then you must agree with my conclusion, right? Okay, so looking at the circles, right, notice that any of the premises that are in two circles, like premise 4, it's in the yellow circle and in the green circle. That means premise 4 is a premise for the main conclusion, and it's a conclusion in the sub-argument. Same thing with P3, right? Premise 3 is a premise in the sub-argument and a conclusion in the sub-sub-argument. Okay. And it didn't have to look like this, right? We could have also had support for premise 1. We could have another bubble on that side. And yes, this could keep on going. But in this case, the person presenting the argument thought that was enough, right? We've got science showing that the universe had a finite age. That means it had a cause. And just appealing to the intuition that if something began to exist, something must have caused it, right? And then hoping that you'll just agree that only God could be the cause of the universe, right? Now, if someone like William Lane Craig that I mentioned, when they present this argument, they do provide sub-arguments for number 5 as well. I just didn't want to make it too complicated, right? So I just focused on some of the premises to provide sub-arguments for. Let me see, did I have another? Okay, so try it on your own. Maybe this will make it make more sense if you try it yourself. Right? Try to identify the sub-arguments. So that means first, identify what the main conclusion is, right? You got to follow the advice that I gave earlier about how to reconstruct an argument. Find the main conclusion first. What main point is this person trying to make? Then find the premise or premises that support it directly, and then see if any of those premises themselves are being backed up by a further argument or by further premises. So this is not something you have to turn in, so don't get nervous. Just try to do it the best you can, okay? I'll give you like 10 minutes. Do you have any questions about what I'm asking you to do? So identify the sub-premise and the sub-conclusion, right? Where the sub-conclusion is going to be a premise in the main argument. Okay. Okay, trial by fire. Go ahead. Okay, how did that go? You get done? Confusing, tricky? At least the last one is tricky, right? Number 5. Yeah, they are hard, and I'm hardly giving you any time to do it, right? So it makes sense that it'd be hard. I had to look over them and scratch my head a few times trying to figure it out. It's hard because sometimes a conclusion or a sub-conclusion is part of a longer sentence, and you have to know to break the sentence apart. Yeah, you're on 3. That's all right. But just for time concerns, let's just go through them together. Number 1. Okay, first step first. What's the conclusion? What's the conclusion in number 1? Yeah, it's pretty obvious, right? That's coming out the gate swinging, right? We should shut down all nuclear and power plants. Yeah, it seems pretty obvious that that's the conclusion. What is the premise being provided in support of it? Yeah, that it's harmful to humans, right? Because look, we have that word since right after. And remember, since is a premise indicator. And indeed, what comes after is a premise, but it's not the main premise. It's a sub-premise. Right? So it's confusing. So you correctly identified the... See, this is what I was talking about, right? That you have to keep your critical faculties intact and not just look for the word since, right? Look at the overall argument, the overall thinking and logic of it. And you're right? So the main thing that's being said here is we should shut down nuclear power plants because they're harmful to humans. Now, something was said to support that, right? Is it harmful to humans? Well, I don't know, right? Someone doesn't know, or if they think we need refreshing our memory or something like that. There was a premise being provided in support of that, which is radiation can cause cancer. Exactly, Maggie. Yes, exactly. So, as if you're to do the circles, right? The top circle would be something like nuclear power plants can cause cancer, or radiation can cause cancer. That supports the conclusion, the sub-conclusion, radiation from nuclear power plants is harmful to humans. And then that sub-conclusion is the premise that supports the main conclusion, we should shut down all nuclear power plants. You're not seeing the page, like where it says exercise, identify the sub-argument? Do you see me? Connie is not seeing the exercise, which would be weird. Give her just a sec. Oh, weird. What do you see underneath me? See, for me and for most other people, I'm pointing at the exercise right down below. I'm in a small little box and a really big white box underneath me with the exercise. That would be bad if you can't see those. Well, reconstructing arguments is from earlier, right? We're on identify the sub-argument. That's right here. But that's what I'm wondering. You don't see this? It could be a browser thing for sure. But it seems like there's some other confusion as well. I'm going to give people a second to respond. Yeah, Connie, you might want to just do something like that. 9 times out of 10, restarting something fixes it. Right? You know. Oh, you only see that still. Huh, weird. So it was just kind of stuck on it. I wonder what happens. Does it do anything if I go like this? Is it moving at all? Okay, well, let's keep going here. So number 1, I think, is pretty straightforward. Okay. Conclusion, we should shut down all nuclear plants. Why? Well, the premise is radiation from power plants is harmful to humans. Okay? The sub premise for that is it can cause cancer. Yeah? So you have a main claim and your support for that claim, and then support for their support. Right? A sub argument for the main premise. Okay. Number 2, this might actually, to me, this is I think I came up with this one, and it's the trickiest one. I should change it. Now, what's the main conclusion? There is a nice conclusion indicator, and in this case, it's correctly telling you the main conclusion. Anna, you're right. It's that's for number 3. Maggie, lying should be illegal. Yes, not immoral activity should be illegal, right? That's a sub conclusion. So sorry, maybe you thought I was asking about the sub argument. That is part of the sub argument for sure. But to get there, first I want to just ask, what's the main conclusion? The main conclusion is lying should be illegal. And then you've got 2 premises. One that says all immoral activity should be illegal. Lying is immoral. Well, of course, then it follows that lying should be illegal. Right? So we see we've got a nice little structure there again, where you've got 2 premises. It's one of those deductive arguments where the truth of the premises would guarantee the truth of the conclusion, right? So if those premises really were true, if it really is true that all immoral activity should be illegal, and it really is true that lying is immoral, then it follows that lying should be illegal. Right? That's the main argument. But of course, what about this claim that immoral activity should be illegal? Well, this person has this imagined person that I created, has created a very awkward sub-argument, because they're basically just begging the question, right? They're saying, well, if something is immoral, that's good enough of a reason for it to be illegal. So that means immoral activity should be illegal. Right? Kind of a bad sub-argument. But the point here is that they were trying to provide extra support for this one particular premise. And it's a very controversial premise, right? Again, ideally, all your premises would be things that everybody already agrees with. Then it's very easy to convince people of your conclusion. In this case, of course, someone made this outrageous claim that all immoral activity should be illegal. Well, you got to back up that claim, right? Just like you're backing up your main claim, sometimes you make a supportive claim, and that supportive claim itself needs to be supported. Not always, right? So we don't have to do the toddler thing and do it forever. It's contextual. It depends on who you're talking about, what the subject matter is, what you think needs to be backed up and explained more. You know? Okay. Okay, so that's that one. Number 3, the main conclusion is, Socrates is mortal. Is the sub-argument that lying is immoral. The sub-argument is this. Okay? Sub-premise 1. Something being immoral is good enough reason for it to be illegal. Sub-conclusion, all immoral activity should be illegal. That's the sub-argument. Now, the conclusion of that sub-argument, all immoral activity should be illegal, is of course one of the main premises in the main argument. Yeah, because the main argument again is all immoral activity should be illegal. Lying is immoral, so lying should be illegal. That's the main argument, right? The sub-argument is in support of that first premise, right? The idea that all immoral activity should be illegal. Right? We ought to support that because that's a controversial, bold claim to make. And they provided it, right? This imagined person is basically begging the question, simply saying in another way that all immoral activity should be illegal. So it's a bad argument, but there was an attempt at a sub-argument here. Okay. Maggie is saying something. Socrates is Greek, so he is human. Yeah, but there's one more. Right? So the conclusion, of course, is Socrates is mortal. Right? And I've given you this little example. This is a classic argument when you lay it out in premise conclusion format. People have been using this example for centuries. Right? If Socrates is human, then he is mortal. Socrates is human, so therefore Socrates is mortal. Right? That's the main argument. Right? If Socrates is human, he is mortal. Socrates is human, so he is mortal. Right? That's the main argument. Now here, an argument was provided to support the claim that Socrates is human. Now, this is one of those examples that's like, well, nobody really needs support for that, right? So it's kind of a silly example, but we're just showing that you could provide extra support for any conclusion. Mortal, yes. Yeah, exactly. That's the other premise, right? So the main argument is, again, if Socrates is human, then he is mortal. Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, suppose someone were to say, well, prove to me that Socrates is human. Then the person provides a sub-argument that says, well, look, if Socrates is Greek, then he's human. Right? Socrates is Greek, therefore he is human. Right? And so now we've provided support for that premise, Socrates is human. Right? So now we have Socrates is human, all humans are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. You could think of those circles again, right? Here's a premise. All humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Socrates is mortal. Right? One circle. But then we have that one premise that says Socrates is human. And we can have another circle around it that says Socrates is Greek. All Greeks are human. Therefore, Socrates is human. Yeah. Well, Maggie, the argument it's kind of a toy example, right? It just shows you the logic of statements. Nobody is really going around arguing that Socrates is mortal. Everybody already agrees with that, right? It's more to show you that you can provide this kind of logical support for any kind of claim, right? So if my claim is Socrates is mortal, then I could give an argument for that. I could say Socrates is human, right? And aren't all humans mortal? Well, then it follows that Socrates is human. Yeah. So it's a toy example, as we sometimes call it. Not a realistic example of an argument that someone would provide, but it still shows you the logical structure of good arguments. Yeah. Now you can't hear me. Weird. I think everyone else can. All sorts of problems, huh? Oh, by the way, I should mention, in case this causes confusion, I'm recording. Yeah, okay, so put a pin in what I was just going to say. Rachel, I forgot. For some of the exercises, I had done that. And I meant to do that for all the exercises because I don't have a Blackboard that I can just do it with you, right? So I was going to do that for all these, and I kind of forgot. So for the next time, hopefully I'll have it all written out so you can see it better. It's a lot of extra work for me, but that's okay because it's special circumstances, right? I just have to find the time and actually go through and do that. So it's a good idea to sort of do that, and I'll work on that. Yeah. No, don't be sorry to ask. Makes sense. What I was going to say anyway is the videos of our meetings are now going to be in the main modules. So don't go to conferences anymore. I don't want to use that software anymore because it makes bad videos and then they disappear and people can't access them. So I'm recording these myself with my own software and I'm putting it on YouTube. Unlisted, okay, so nobody else can see you or my interactions with you, okay? It's totally private, but then you'll be able to access those videos really easily through Canvas in the main modules. So if you go to this week's module, you'll find Tuesday's session right there. It'll say Tuesday's class or Tuesday's meeting or something like that. So yeah, I wanted to say that because at least one person emailed me saying that they could not find our last session, and that's the reason. That's the reason. Okay. I'll wait to see what Connie has to say. Okay. Yeah, I'll try to. In general anyway, try to do more of that on here. It's a lot nicer to be able to sort of have a blackboard and a classroom of people, and then I can ask, what's the conclusion? I can write down the conclusion, sort of go through it together. But this whole experience is so different, so I feel like, yes, I might have to just do that ahead of time myself so we can go through it in that way. Okay, 4. Okay. I should move either to France or Spain. I'm not going to pick France because I have no personal connections there, so I'll pick Spain. What's the main conclusion there? This is not really an argument that you have with anyone else, right? This is an argument you have in your own head. You're going through pros and cons, you're reasoning. That still counts as a type of argument, right? Because you're trying to come up with a conclusion. Where am I going to go? Why should I go there? Right, so in this case, your sort of reasoning is, well, I know it's going to be France or Spain, but it's not going to be France, right? France is out, so it's going to be Spain. Well, what was your reason for discounting France? Yeah, exactly. The sub. See, Maggie, you got it in this case, right? Because it's a very simple kind of case. The sub argument is you've got no connections there, right? So the main structure is pretty easy. It's going to be France or Spain. It's not going to be France, so it's going to be Spain. Hold on, why did you eliminate France? Well, I have no connections there. It's harder to move somewhere if you don't know anybody there. Makes sense, right? You provided support in your own mind, at least, for eliminating that candidate. You have some good reasons to say, I'm not going to do France, even though that's a place that I'd love to move to because it's beautiful, and so is Spain. I really want to go to either one of them. But when I think about it, the pros and cons, really, I've got no connections in France, so I better pick Spain. So I think that one's much more straightforward and easier. So that's good. So you understand at least what the point of a sub-argument is. And the point is not complicated. It only gets complicated when you have to look at big arguments and try to dissect them and analyze them. The main point is super easy, right? I'm making an argument, I made a claim, and I provided support. But my support itself might need some extra support. Right? That's all that we mean by sub-arguments, is providing support for your support. Okay, the last one is a doozy. And you're doing some high-level analysis. If you're thinking about this argument and at all keeping up with it, you're doing some high-level abstract philosophical thoughts that, this is a difficult argument that philosophers have been struggling with and still struggle with, right? So if you can at least see the structure of the argument, then you know how to go about tackling, evaluating it. Yeah, the main conclusion is my mind and my body cannot be the same thing. The premises in support of that are, if my mind has different properties from my body, right? If my mind has different properties from my body, then they can't be the same thing. Right? My body and my mind do have different properties, so they cannot be the same thing, right? That's the main argument, right? So let me say that again. If my mind has different properties, right? There are things about it that are true of my mind, but that are not true of my body. That's the sub-conclusion, right? Oh, sorry, no, that is the sub-argument. Yes, you're right. I haven't gotten there yet, but yes, you're right. So, just establishing the main argument, right? If my mind has different properties from my body, then they're not the same thing. That means my mind and my body are two different things. And here the argument says, this is René Descartes' argument, by the way, famous philosopher, mathematician, scientist. This is his argument for mind-body dualism, which is a traditional religious idea, of course, right? It's the idea that your soul, in this case he's calling it a mind, is a separate substance from your body, right? We talked a little bit about this earlier. This is his argument for that, basically saying if they have the same properties, they can't be the same, or sorry, if they have different properties, they cannot be the same thing. They do have different properties, so they cannot be the same thing, right? That's the main argument. Well, suppose I were to challenge Descartes and say, wait a minute, do they really have different properties? Give me an argument for that, right? Then he'd give me a sub-argument, and in this case what he says is, well, look, I can doubt the existence of my body, but I cannot doubt the existence of my mind. So, they have different properties, right? This is tricky, by the way. I think it's wrong. We're not doing evaluating, right? We're just looking at the structure, right? So the structure is the same sort of thing where if my mind has different properties from my body, they're not the same thing. They do have different properties, so my mind and body are not the same thing, right? But here, this idea of they have different properties, well, maybe we need some support for that. What's Descartes' support for the idea that the mind and body have different properties? Well, I can doubt the existence of my body. I cannot doubt the existence of my mind. And this is a philosophical argument that might need more spelling out. All he means is that you can imagine that your body isn't even real. Right? You can imagine that you're in a matrix. You can imagine that you're dreaming. You can imagine that you're hallucinating. Right? This body that you have might not even be your real body. Maybe you have no body at all. But Descartes says you can't do that about your own mind. Your mind must exist, because how else could you be sitting there thinking about stuff? Right? So you have to exist as a thinking being at least, says Descartes. So that means there's something true about the mind, namely, it's indubitable. You cannot doubt the existence of your own mind. That's to doubt your own existence, which you can't do if you're doubting. You got to be there to do the doubting. Yeah, basically, for Descartes, it's, there might be a subtle difference, but it's basically the same thing. It's the conscious part of you that thinks and that feels and that reasons and that looks to the future and thinks about the past. And it's the conscious part of you that Christians hope will continue to exist after the body dies, right? That all sounds like the soul. That's what Descartes calls the mind, right? Yes. Well, you see the argument anyway, right? His main point in pointing out that you can doubt the existence of your body but not your mind is to show that they must be two different things, right? And if they're that they have different properties, right? And if they have different properties, they must be different things. Then therefore, the mind must not be a physical thing. It has to exist. It's a substance, a real thing that exists, but it's completely non-physical for Descartes. Because physical things can be doubted, but your own mind cannot. Right? So if we were to take this, the Philosophy 10 class, we'd spend a lot more time on this. Very quickly, I think it's wrong for the reasons that, you can doubt all sorts of stuff, and it doesn't mean it's not the same thing, right? The morning star and the evening star, for example. People didn't know that they were the same object. Right? So you might doubt the existence of the morning star because you're never up early enough, and see the evening star. You believe in that, but you don't believe in the morning star. It does not mean that they're not the same thing, right? So this is why I think the argument fails. But that's not the point of this. The point of this is to see the structure of the argument, right? So that you can then go on to do what I was just doing, evaluating each step along the way. Okay, questions about that exercise? Well, the hour and a half really flew by today, but I guess we are done with this section. I had hoped to start on argument structure, but since it is just our natural stopping time anyway, and this slideshow is done, I suppose we can just be done here. Okay. Do you have any questions? It's confusing, but kind of fun. Oh, that's good. Okay, thank you. See, have a nice weekend. I'll see you on Tuesday.
You are currently the only person in this conference.